the Honorable Dan Turton, a commissioned officer for the 44th President of the United States and a proud son of the U.S. House of Representatives. Today I'm going to tell you the story of my friendship with Dan and how he helped and guided me over the last 17 years. However, my story is just a small sample of the mentoring that Dan did throughout his life. There are hundreds of people in this town who had a coffee, a phone call, an informational interview with Dan for the sole purpose of helping them find a job or solve a problem. There are dozens of people in this room who could tell a story just like mine, one where Dan's help went beyond coffee and resumes and into a world of friendship and mentorship. People like John Samuels, Ashley Jones, Adam Arguelles, Catelyn O'Neill, Sunny Sinha, Mike Mullen, Lauren Beliv, and so many others who I apologize I neglected to mention. One of our friends, Mike Hacker, said to me just last week, Dan is still the guy he wants to grow up to be. Now that's an amazing statement. If you've seen Hacker's impressive beard, he's pretty grown already. Let's talk about friendship. And of course, you cannot talk about Dan and friendship without saying the name Matt Gelman. For me, Dan and Matt defined the phrase best friends. I've never known two men who were so close, even if they had a funny way of showing it. Matt, Dan called you the cat. He said if he dropped you from a roof 1,000 times, you would land on your feet every single time. He said you had an instinct for falling up. In fact, he called you charmed, not charming, charmed. Nobody even uses that word anymore. He really admired and loved you. Of course, to be fair, one time when I asked him for your phone number, he only gave it to me after I agreed to his terms to put it on every spam list I could find. So my apologies for all those Ted Cruz campaigns. But there are a lot of Dan's friends here, so I'm going to start with a little bit of audience participation. In a moment, I'll ask you to raise your hand if you ever picked on or made fun of Dan Turton. Don't get too excited. I'm going to give you an example. Many years ago, Dan invited me to lunch at the White House Mess. We were walking from the East Wing to the West Wing, and we got to what's known as the Palm Room, just before you get to the West Colonnade next to the famous Rose Garden. And through the window in the door, we saw the President of the United States walking towards us. And not just any president, we're talking Barack Obama, so a really, really good president. And Dan confidently grabbed the door and opened it. So confidently, in fact, that the door hit the door stopper, slipped out of his hand and slammed shut. So he always finishes the job. He opened it a second time. The president walked through unbothered. I don't even think he noticed the double door open. But when he was out of earshot, I asked Dan the obvious question. Is it White House protocol to always open the door twice for the president? So raise your hand up high if Dan ever picked on you or you ever picked on Dan. Well, congratulations, because that's one of the ways you knew he cared about you. He let you in. But our conversations were not always so casual. In the beginning, our relationship was much, much more formal. I met Dan almost exactly 17 years ago. It was late December 2006. I was the Republican clerk of the House Rules Committee, and I just lost my job because Republicans had just lost the House to the good guys, House Democrats and company man. But fortunately for me, the Democratic staff director had just offered me a job as a nonpartisan clerk. There was one really big problem. That guy, who was about to rehire me to the Rules Committee, abruptly quit his job the day he found out that Dan Turton was also hired to be staff director. Now, Dan was as surprised as anyone to find out there were two majority staff directors. In our business, that's what we might call a Louise Slaughter special. She just hired two people and sat back and waited for the straw. strong one to survive. So this is Christmas. I have no idea if I'm rehired or out of a job. And so I decided to do my best George Costanza impersonation and just show up to work. I went into the majority office by myself every day in late December. I spent my time methodically making an informational binder for this new staff director who I'd never met. When this terrifying figure in the form of Dan Turton finally showed up for his first day, he didn't talk to me at all. But he also didn't ask me why I was there. So day one, I didn't get physically removed by security. Success. Sometime around the end of the week, he finally came to my office and said something like, "Hey, what's your name? Let's talk." So we went alone into Louise Slaughter's office. I gave him my resume. I gave him the binder that I'd meticulously made. I told him, "I'm a Republican, but you can trust me." He flipped through the binder as I nervously told him every thought I'd ever had. Finally, when I shut up, he said two things. One, why in the world would you lead with "I'm a Republican"? Don't do that again. And two, this binder is the most helpful thing I've seen all week. You have a job. That was the first good advice Dan ever gave me. Don't lead by saying I am affiliated with the enemy. So our working relationship began. After he found out I was working weekends renovating houses in Virginia, he gave me additional responsibilities on the committee and a $15,000 raise so I could put all my time and energy and weekends into just one job. I cannot tell you how significant that was. Not only that this man was relying on me more, but it was the first time in my entire life I felt like I could breathe financially. Dan Turton saved my young career. He pulled me out of financial hardship, and most importantly, he gave me his trust. Eventually, when Dan became a father, he'd sometimes bring the boys in the office, in their car seats, sitting them down securely by his desk. Not often, but at times he would have to run off to an emergency meeting with Speaker Pelosi or Whip Clyburn's staff, and I'd keep an eye on him. That was all well and good, but it became terrifying once they started to walk. I set up an obstacle course made up of chairs and 3-ring binders to try to contain them or at least slow them down. I remember one time in particular, I was trying to make sure there were no pages missing from a 1,000-page conference report, while Lane was trying to see if Shaw's finger would fit into an electrical outlet. It's a long time ago. I don't remember who was playing Cain and who was playing Abel in that story, so I apologize if I got that number. But the point is, the Rules Committee was and is a family. Our families lived these jobs with us, and Dan made us feel a part of his family. At one point, I wanted to move closer to work. I found an apartment that just by chance was 1 block from Dan's house in Eastern Market. He advised me to write a check right now and take it with me. He said the neighborhood's fantastic, you can walk to work, and it's cheap. Do not leave without signing the lease. I was the only one that showed up with a check in my hand. I got that competitive apartment, Dan's advice. I remember his wife Ashley sitting with me and some friends on the back patio of that apartment one beautiful summer night. So we played guitar, talked about her brother, gossiped about Dan and random members of Congress. Ashley was a wonderful woman who I deeply miss. It was on my birthday, January 10, 13 years ago, when I heard that there was a fire. I ran from the Capitol building to Dan's house to find him in the living room of the fire department. He was in an absolute trance. At one point I helped him pack a bag. I remember saying not to forget his phone charger, and he said, "Good call, Don, good call." Speaking the way he would when I suggested a change to a committee report or a speech. For both of us, it felt like packing the perfect bag gave us something to do in a moment when nothing could be done, if that makes sense. I then drove him to a hotel, not knowing at all what to say. And that man ended up consoling me. And by the way, this sort of behavior runs in the family because both Ashley and Dan's mother gave me the biggest mom bear hugs you could imagine at the hospital last week. And Bree and you for the kindness you've shown me. This family, during their tragedy, has been consoling me. Can you imagine? January 2011 was a dark time, but fortunately, Dan and I had mostly lighter moments. Dan liked to help people, but nothing lit him up more than a job hunt. He would coach anyone with a job search, whether they were an unpaid intern, a CEO, a House Chief of Staff. Hell, he might help a Senate Chief of Staff if they figured out how to ask nicely. When I told him I was going to do everything I could to get a job at the White House, and he was all in. He meticulously read my resume and reference lists multiple times. I lined up members of Congress to call the White House. Dan would tell me when to have them call, who to have them call, what to suggest they focused on. He told me what Katie, who would interview me, looked and sounded like. He said Katie was a serious person, no nonsense, but just be yourself, Don. She'll like you. He told me where I would go for the interview, what the room would look like. We didn't miss a single detail. The amount of effort we put in this thing, you'd think we were planning to rob a bank. After weeks of talking many times a day about this one job, Dan told me it was the best campaign he'd ever seen. And if I didn't get it, it wasn't my fault. He was optimistic, but he was setting me up for a soft landing if I failed. So when I got the call that I got the job, they told me I couldn't tell anyone but my mother. I told my mother, but I called Dan first. Dan checked on me on January 6th, when my boss, Jim McGovern, and I were chased off the House floor by an angry mob. When the pandemic hit, we looked out for each other. The store shelves empty. I gave Dan some disposable gloves and 2 cases of canned beefaroni. Stuff lasts forever. We sat on my front porch and talked about the end of the world. He later said that my girlfriend Ashley and I could move in with him in Virginia if the city got too dangerous. I quietly hoped he cleared that living situation with Bree, but I didn't ask. But let us take a moment to be thankful for today, as he'd want us to. Because as Dan and I sat on my front porch 6 feet apart, thousands of people were dying every day from a terrible pandemic, and their families and friends could not come together and celebrate their lives and comfort each other like we're able to do today. So the world didn't end after all. Even if it feels like it fell off its axis when we lost our beloved brother last week. We still have each other. We have the memories Dan left us. Because he was always around. He seemed to be everywhere, didn't he? Sometimes I thought he had a secret twin. In fact, we were just together in Chicago for an Obama reunion. A few of us, I won't name names, but I see some faces. Went to a casino very late one night. Sitting at a blackjack table to my left, Dan bought $200 in chips. I'm cheap, so I bought $150. I've never seen anyone lose $200 so fast. Dan was wiped out before our first drink even arrived. On the other hand, I was up $500 or $600 right away by doing the opposite of what you're supposed to do. But Dan was actually cheering me on. We weren't competing with each other. It was us against the casino, and we were winning. The next day, he told me he had a great time. He also said he ordered an Uber that night, and it drove him exactly 1.5 blocks to his hotel. He said, I had no idea. Nobody picked on Dan Turton harder than Dan Turton. I have one last story, and then I'll shut up. I golfed with Dan one time. He was really good. He shot straight down the fairways, chipped like a god, putted like the devil. I mean, I don't know if he was a great golfer or if he just had the game of his life, but he cleaned my clock. Months, maybe even years later, I texted him saying how good he was, how impressed I was. In his reply, he said that he loved me. Dan Turton, the Iceman, Mr. Never Let Him See You Sweat, put the word love in writing to to another man. I hadn't remembered that text or what he said, but man, it warmed my heart when I found it this week. And who would ever thought that it was so easy to melt Dan's heart? All you had to do was call him a great athlete. I wish I had the time to tell you so much more. Like the real estate listings we share with each other but never bought, our great Bitcoin debates, how he always left Bobby Vans before me because he had to get home to his wife and kids. I'd love to tell you about the mandatory 8 a.m. staff meetings and the one time I was 5 hours late to one of them. How in 17 years, I never once saw Dan wear a winter coat, not once. About the time he loaned me his car for a weekend and then refused to sell it to me. So I bought a newer version of that car in spite of him. Or the time I stole his identity for completely legitimate purposes. I could go on and on about Dan's work ethic, his uncanny ability to read people, situations, his quiet acts of kindness, his deep love for his family. But I'll end here. I lost my mentor and my friend. I followed Dan around like a lost puppy dog. I followed in his footsteps to the White House. Today, right now, I have the very staff director job he had the day I met him. But it's not just me who's lost. Dan was the person so many of us call for help, for advice, and sometimes for validation. Feels like we live in a world now without our safety net. I mean, what are we supposed to do now? Call Gelman for advice? Dan Turton was a giant who left his mark on this world. He left his mark on me. He saved my young career. He helped me get the job of a lifetime. He convinced this blue-collar kid who grew up in rusty western New York that he should be a proud Democrat. He walked with me through some of the darkest moments of my life, and he let me walk with him through some of his. Last week, I thought that if ever there were proof that life wasn't fair, this was it. And to be sure, it's not fair what these kids have had to endure. But it occurred to me the really unfair thing would have been not having the chance to know and love Dan Turton for the time that we did. So I love you too, Danny boy. I'm so sorry I went against your first ever advice to me by opening my speech in front of all these people with I used to be a Republican. And if there is a heaven, my boss Jim McGovern said to me the other day, you're probably up there with Louise Slaughter. Bad news, buddy. You're gonna have to stab her until I get there.